Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and finish up the central nervous system, the brain. Moving on to the cerebellum. We had just talked about the diencephalon right here, and the parts of that. So remember, there's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and we are not going to worry about the pineal gland. So now let's move back onto the cerebellum. Okay, when they say by the little brain that lies underneath the occipital lobe, so remember the occipital lobe here, responsible for vision, is at the very back. So this right here is the cerebellum. And it's about the size of a baseball, which actually is pretty large if you think about it. And then that's what actually coordinates skeletal muscle contractions. So you know what is actually causing movement. So coordinates skeletal and muscle contractions to produce a movement. Okay, and it's that right here. So that's the cerebellum. And the last part here of the brain is what's called the brain stem, and there's three parts. The midbrain, which is exactly located where you think it would be, in the middle of the brain. The pons is right here. Part, again, of the brain stem. Think of it like being a stem right here, stem of a tree. So there's the pons right here in the middle, and the medulla oblongata is again here located on that actual stem portion. So let's real briefly mention what each one of those does. So the midbrain, the middle part, it connects the motor pathways between the cerebrum and the lower parts of the nervous system. Okay, and what it means by nervous, but the lower parts of the nervous system, think of all this stuff that's down here, including the spinal cord. So that's the midbrain. It's connecting between the cerebrum and everything below it. And then the pons, what it means by superior, yeah, remember that term again, superior, in front of the medulla. It is involved with things like breathing is one thing, because you don't think about doing that at all. Eye movement, like blinking. And then the last thing, the medulla oblongata, that's another thing that's responsible. It's for all automatic behavior, things that you literally do not think about doing at all. So more again with the breathing, your heart rate. You don't, tell yourself to increase your heart rate whenever you get nervous, but that automatically happens. Blood pressure. That can go up if you get nervous, or if you're in a doctor's office, you feel very nervous. Again, that goes up and you don't tell yourself to do that. So that's blood pressure. And then hiccups. You probably know that you don't tell yourself to start hiccuping, but you do it. Sneezing. If it's a real sneeze, you don't tell yourself to sneeze. And then coughing. You start, sometimes you can't stop, and that's your automatic behavior. And then swallowing is another thing. Generally like swallowing your spit. You don't tell yourself to do it. It just automatically happens, and you have to tell yourself to not do it if it doesn't happen. So that is pretty much it for the main part. So let's kind of review really quickly about kind of everything. Hopefully this is not making you sick. Everything that we've talked about so far. Okay, so the big things that I want you to remember here. Make sure you remember that term interneuron. I'll just go ahead and put a star by the important stuff here. So the brain and things that protect the brain is coming up in a minute, but kind of things that would delay embryonic development and have an effect on the brain. A few of those things which you may have known already, so things like drugs and alcohol, and then also smoking. And then what is actually, does old age cause your brain to shrink? It does. And then does your actual ability to think decline immediately when you start to turn, 50s, 60s? That doesn't happen. It actually happens in your 80s. Okay, and excessive use of alcohol, what it means by, just make sure you understand, that can cause or look like the same effects of old age, but it is not. And then protection, make sure you remember a couple of things that help to protect the brain. One is the bone, and you already know the cranium, and the vertebrae itself helps to protect the spinal cord. The meninges is the membrane. I'm not going to ask you guys to like spell these or anything, but it might be label which one goes, you know, if I were to give you this picture, label which one is dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. Make sure you know which one is on the outside and in the middle and then the closest to the actual brain. And then the fluid, the watery cushion, and the blood-brain barrier, I feel like a lot about, but make sure you know what that does. Again, I'm not going to ask you to list these, but be familiar with what they are and where they're located. So let's see, again, where those three are located. And then these, I want you to do some research on these on your own. Yeah, I'll go ahead and just leave that there. And then the regions of the brain. Okay, make sure you know these. The cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. I will not ask you to list the parts of the cerebrum or anything like that, but just kind of have an idea of, you know, occipital, that's vision, and then frontal. I kind of talked a bit or way more about the cerebrum than I did pretty much anything else. So let me kind of go through the important parts there. The spinal cord, I mentioned that's the communicator between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the lobes are of the cerebrum: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Frontal, again, is in the front. The temporal, important for hearing, and occipital is vision. And then I mentioned that's at the very end, or the back portion of the brain. And I will not have you, you definitely should know where the cerebellum is, where the brainstem is, where the spinal cord is. I would definitely say frontal, parietal is in the middle, and occipital is in the back. And then here, make sure you remember the corpus callosum. I'm spelling that wrong. Is remember the thing that connects one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. And the ridges, the I don't know what you call those, the sort of folds on the brain. Remember, those are the gyri. Again, continuing with the cerebrum, the motor cortex, that's movement. Sensory, again, your senses, things like touch and hearing. And big picture here, who controls what? Left controls the right, right controls the left. Okay, and the sensory, again, that's what's responsible for sensing that something is happening. That receives the message, and then, again, your motor cortex will then move, or tell your body to move. And then the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. You know, the left hemisphere is what they say is more arithmetic and more critical thinking, and the right kind of is responsible for more of the arts and musical inclination, things like that. The corpus callosum, I mentioned again, that's what connects the two hemispheres, the right and the left. And if you cut that, it does not mean that a person would die or that anything would happen to them intellectually. It just stops the communication between the two, and their visual field changes, but not their actual intellect. And then that was just kind of a side note with left-handedness. The diencephalon, those three things that you need to kind of, if I said which of these is a part of the diencephalon portion of the brain, remember thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland, that all has to do with the endocrine system and how hormones and which hormones are sent to which parts of the body. So I'm not going to be super specific about this because we haven't even learned the endocrine system yet. So that's the thalamus. And those are all like and the hypothalamus. I think that's a pretty interesting portion of the brain, because that's what tells your body what's good, whether to start something or to continue to do something, because it's what makes your body feel good. So again, lots of things like binge eating, and I had mentioned hoarding, holding on to things, alcoholism, using too many drugs. That all has to do with the reward center of the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland, that's the actual part that sends out those hormones that would cause changes in a person's behavior sometimes. But again, that's part of the endocrine system. And the cerebellum, that's that little bitty brain at the bottom here of the whole brain, the little brain. It was what actually coordinates the skeletal muscle contractions to make your body move. That's the little cerebellum. And then the last part is the brain stem, and the three parts that you need to know there. Midbrain, easy, it's in the middle of the brain. Pons and the medulla oblongata are lower in the part of the actual brain stem. The midbrain, it is the connection. The pons, that's what both the pons and the medulla oblongata are responsible for that automatic behavior. So just kind of keep in mind here that there are the four parts of the central nervous system. Make sure you could, if I were to ask you to list anything, it might be that, but remember, we've got the cerebrum, then we've got the diencephalon, then we've got the cerebellum, and then we've got the brain stem. So hopefully this kind of put it all together. It's a lot of information. I'm not going to be super specific about listing or anything like that. This is just big picture of the parts of your brain and how they kind of all work together. So hopefully this kind of helped you, again, put it all together. And this pretty much concludes the brain portion of the central or the whole nervous system, but specifically the central nervous system.